Hello everyone. Welcome to a brand new bonus video. I'm going to be discussing the basics of Form 2848 and the 8821. Now the 2848 is the power of attorney, IRS power of attorney, and the 8821 is a tax information authorization form. Right? We're going to talk about the differences between the two and how to fill them out, how to avoid making mistakes so they don't get rejected, and opinions. We're going to be talking about opinions from different tax practitioners about when they use one versus the other, because there's no unified consensus between tax practitioners with regard to that. Okay, I know what I do and I will discuss it, but other tax practitioners might prefer using one form over the other. All right, and once you become an enrolled agent, once you're a licensed tax practitioner, you can decide to basically use either form depending on what your practice model is. Okay, so we're going to discuss that. Now, this is a group poll that I posed to enrolled practitioners in a representation group, a large representation group on Facebook. Facebook has a number of tax groups that are just for professionals. They screen the people that attempt to get into these groups. And, every now and then we'll get someone that just wants to post spam or whatever. And usually those people are deleted pretty quickly. But this particular representation group is only for enrolled practitioners. So it has to be someone who is covered by Circular 230 and who can actually do representation in order to be admitted to this group. So the group includes enrolled agents, certified public accountants, and attorneys. Once you receive your EA license, I do recommend joining this group, even if you don't use Facebook for very much or you don't like it. I know I don't like it either, but this is one of the only reasons why I'm on Facebook is because these types of groups exist there just for tax practitioners, and it allows you to kind of bounce ideas off of other really experienced tax professionals, which is invaluable, especially if you're a solo practitioner. If you just practice on your own and you don't belong to a firm. So you have to be either an EA, a CPA, or an attorney. But once you receive your license, then you can join this group, even as a newbie, right? And even if you have no experience with representation, this is a great place to learn. All right. So I posed this question to the group because I don't do very much representation work. I have a lot of experience only because I've been in this business for so long. You just pick things up as you go along. And of course, if you have any type of a client base and you're doing this for any amount of time, you're going to have to do some rep work, even if it's not something that you enjoy, which is basically me, right? I don't like doing rep work. I don't like being in an adversarial position with the IRS or any kind of confrontation with the IRS. I don't like it. But of course, I have existing clients. And if they receive an IRS notice or they get audited, then I'm not going to just kick them to the curb. I'm going to respond to that notice, or I'm going to represent them in the audit if they want me to. All right, if they hire me to do that. So I do representation work. It's not something that I actively seek. I'm really busy already teaching, but I do have an existing client base, and I did an audit last year. I represented a client who is an existing client. So it is something that I do. It's just not something that I really enjoy. But there are some tax practitioners that love rep work, and even some tax practitioners where that's their entire practice model and that's all they do. Kind of like attorneys' offices where you might have an attorney's office that does just divorces, and then you might have an attorney's office that just, sets up trusts for people, right? Those are two very different areas of the law, right? And the same holds true for tax practitioners. There are some tax practitioners that only do rep work, and other tax practitioners will refer cases to them. Rep work can be a lot of things, right? It can be an audit, it can be responding to a notice, it can even be something like representation for sales tax, which is a state issue, right? And not a federal issue. So there's all different types of tax practices out there, obviously, but some tax practitioners do a lot more rep work than others. And all of them, if they do any kind of rep work, are going to be using IRS power of attorney forms. But I wanted to know, based on what other tax practitioners did, how often they use the 8821 versus the 2848. Okay, when in the terms or in the process of their engagement did they use the 2848 right from the beginning? Or do they use the 8821 first and only use the 2848 if they know they're going to be representing a client? That sort of thing. Okay, so I asked this question. My question was, can I take an informal poll of the group? I don't do much rep work and hardly use Form 8821, which is the tax information authorization form. I haven't filled one of these out in a very long time, except as part of like a teaching exercise, because if I do have to represent a client, it's always going to be an existing client of mine. And I'm just going to go straight to the 2848, which allows me to represent them, not just get tax information. So I always, if I do have a rep case, I always fill out and submit a 2848 to obtain transcripts or to find out about unfiled returns. I usually contact PPS directly for this. PPS is just the short name for the Practitioner Priority Service. Okay, Practitioner Priority Service is a special phone line, if you don't know this already, that's just for tax practitioners to contact the IRS. All right, it's not the same number that regular taxpayers use. All right, so this is Practitioner Priority Service. Do many of you submit Form 8821 to get taxpayer information and only have the taxpayer fill out Form 2848 if you take on the client with a formal engagement letter? I was watching a CPE webinar recently where the speaker said that they only fill out the Form 2848 after they have a signed engagement letter, and they will only add tax years to the Form 2848 if they have a new engagement letter. The practitioner treated each tax year as a separate engagement. Okay, so I'm not going to mention who this tax practitioner was or the course or anything else like that. But this other tax practitioner, he stated that this was the way that he did it in his office. So he would only use the 2848 if he knew he was going to take on the engagement, and he would only have the taxpayer fill it out, the power of attorney form, after basically he had a signed engagement letter and presumably a deposit as well. Okay, because people who do rep work, they generally require deposits up front before they do any kind of work on a case. Okay, now I'm going to go through the tax practitioner's different opinions here as well. So Carol, remember these are all enrolled practitioners now. Okay, these are either lawyers, CPAs, or enrolled agents who are licensed to represent taxpayers before every level of the IRS. Okay, so they can choose which form they want to use, and many of them will choose one or the other first based on their practice model, okay, which I'm going to discuss here so you kind of understand it. Okay. Now, Carol states, we have only used the 2848 and usually list a range of years for which to obtain information needed. Now, this is basically what I do. Okay. I don't use the 8821. If I have a taxpayer who says, I received a notice, or back when I was still doing delinquent returns, if I had a person who came in and had like 5 years of unfiled returns or something like that, then I would always just fill out the 2848 with the taxpayer, because most of the time they weren't sure about which years they had unfiled or whether they had years in collections already or whatever. Then I would just fill out the 2848. I would call practitioner priority line and fax them the 2848 while I'm on the phone with them. Right? I'm calling the practitioner priority line with the IRS, and I would ask, okay, so I have this new client. I just faxed you my 2848, which he signed. Can you tell me how many unfiled years he has, if he has years in collections, that sort of thing? And I do that all over the phone while I'm with the IRS, because I want to know how bad the situation is, how many unfiled years the person has, what that sort of thing. Okay, all right. So this is what I do. I always just go straight to the 2848. Now, Jason responded, for me, it depends. If I know absolutely nothing about the case, once I'm paid, I use the 8821. All right, so he has the taxpayer pay a deposit before he starts any kind of work on the case, which is smart, especially if you do rep work with delinquent taxpayers. You know, if they're not paying the IRS, then there's a very good chance they're not going to want to pay you either, right? So he gets his deposit, and then if he knows nothing about the case whatsoever, then he uses the 8821, which allows him to receive information from the IRS regarding that taxpayer's accounts, but it doesn't allow him to represent the taxpayer. All right, this is just a situation where he's just obtaining information first. And maybe he's still deciding whether or not he wants to take the engagement. If I know they are in collections, exams, RO assigned, etc., once I'm paid, I use the 2848. Okay. I do not treat each year as a separate engagement, but I will include the specific years I'm working on the engagement letter. My 2848 and 8821 always cover 1990 through 3 years forward though. Okay, so he goes back really far. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, then just listen to me. I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to show you examples of the forms when they're filled out so you can understand what I'm saying. But he says my 2848 and 8821 always covered 1990 through 3 years forward. So he goes back really far because if you don't list a specific year on the either the 8821 or the 2848, then the IRS won't talk to you about it. They can't legally, so they won't. So he goes back really far because there's always a chance that you have a person who has a very old tax year that's in collections. All right, that can happen. And we're just talking about federal issues here, but remember that many times you'll have a state income tax issue as well. And there are many states that are a lot more aggressive than the IRS. So the IRS usually will ask for 6 years back if it's a person who is a delinquent filer. Usually, sometimes you have to go back further, but there are states where you have to file basically every delinquent return going back 15, sometimes even 20 years. And then that case becomes very difficult. It's very difficult to get those old, transcripts or those old W-2s, and most of the time the taxpayer doesn't have anything. But for example, California has a 20-year collection statute, and California is extremely aggressive. They will chase the taxpayer forever. They'll chase them out of state. The taxpayer could die, and the California will place liens on their home and all kinds of stuff. So there's a possibility many times that you do have to go back further than 6 years or even sometimes 10 years with the IRS as well as the state. Now, it's rare, but it does happen. And if you decide to take on representation cases, then there's a chance that you will have a situation where the taxpayer tells you one thing, oh yeah, I filed tax returns like 5 years ago or 4 years ago. And then you call the IRS and the story is completely different. It's true, it'll happen. Taxpayers will come in and tell you one thing, and then you contact either the state or the IRS, and they'll tell you this person has never filed a tax return or this person hasn't filed a tax return in 10 years or more. Okay? I've had that happen multiple times. I'm just telling you. Okay. So Jason continues and he says, we don't do anything without getting 4 items. And this particular practitioner does only rep work. He specializes in representation cases and delinquent filers. So he's very experienced in this regard. Okay. We don't do anything without getting 4 items. Once we receive these 4 items, we start. So these items are a signed engagement letter. This is a standard scoping letter. All it states is that we will investigate their situation and we charge a flat fee for this. An ACH or credit card authorization form, and this is to collect our analysis fee. So this is his first steps when he takes in a new client. Okay, you understand what I'm talking about here, right? Assigned 8821 or 2848, which one I use depends on the type of engagement. Say, see original comments, we talks about right here. So if he's just doing like a scoping analysis, he does the 8821. But if, for example, a person brings in an IRS letter and the IRS letter states that that person is already in collections, then you know that you're going to need the 2848, because the collections is not going to talk to you without a power of attorney. They won't. So if the person is already in collections or in exams, which means they already have received an audit notice, and this practitioner knows that the IRS is not going to speak to him without a 2848 in that case, then that's how he makes his decision on which form he's going to use. Okay. And then a 7216 consent to disclose. This isn't mandatory, but I get it signed just in case I need to disclose the information to a third party. All right, I don't use this form, but presumably Jason here does enough representation cases that he just gets this from the get-go, just in case he needs it. Okay. I do not even think about the taxpayer anymore until I receive all 4 of these items signed. As you can see, doing it this way, it doesn't matter if the client isn't truthful. Honestly, I take everything the client says during the initial consult with a grain of salt. It doesn't matter what they say, because I'm going to get down to the bottom of it anyway once I do my analysis. Once I've done my analysis, and I then draw up another engagement letter with a new fee for the next step of the process. Okay, so this is what this tax practitioner does in his office. This is his practice model. Okay, now Kathy, who's a different tax practitioner, stated, unless I'm positive that I'm going to represent and need more authority, I typically get an 8821 first, which is just a tax information authorization. I typically go back 10 years on it. So she doesn't go back as far as Jason. Okay, but this is what she does. Once I've reviewed transcripts and determined it's something that I want to tackle, I get a signed engagement letter and a retainer. Then I do the 2848 specifically for the years that are at issue. So this is how she does it. She goes back 10 years on the 8821 initially, and then she'll contact the IRS, find out what's going on with the taxpayer's account, and then at that point she decides whether or not she wants to take the client at all. And if the client agrees basically to pay a retainer and sign the engagement letter, then at that point she'll have the client sign the 2848. Okay. Now Jeff is another tax practitioner. He states that he goes straight to the 2848 and leaves them in place so that he has a marketing tool. It doesn't come without risk, however. You can't ignore levy notices, NODs, etc. But I don't mind the opportunity to reconnect, as then they see me as the easiest path to resolution. So he doesn't use the 8821. He basically states that he uses the 2848 exclusively. Corey states that after the initial conversation, I send the new client the POA, engagement letter, and credit card authorization form. Once the card clears, I file the POA and do phase 1 of my process, which includes transcripts, etc. Phase 2 is a separate engagement, but the same POA. So what this means is that he just uses the 2848 too. So he uses the IRS POA, power of attorney form, and once he gets his deposit as well as the engagement letter signed, then he will submit the POA, which is the power of attorney, the 2848, to the IRS, and he'll do, his investigative process to find out exactly how many unfiled years the taxpayer has, whatever. And then he requests the transcripts, finds out what's going on, and then at that point, the second part of the engagement would be phase 2, basically representing the taxpayer at that point, or actually filing those returns. And for that, he states he treats it as a separate engagement, probably gets a new engagement letter along with another deposit once he finds out how bad the situation is, right? Obviously, a person who only has like 2 unfiled returns in the past is not going to be as bad as someone who has 10 unfiled returns and then like half of them are in collections, right? Those are going to be very different prices in terms of engagements, right? Right, that makes sense, doesn't it? So he treats the second half, when he's actually doing the representation, as phase 2, and that's a separate engagement. But the point is, it's the same POA. right? He has a 2848 already in place. It's already been faxed and accepted to the IRS and processed, though, so he can do anything he needs to do going forward with that 2848, which he's already submitted. Chris states, I would only do the 2848 when I actually do represent them. The 8821 is fine for getting any documents. So this particular practitioner prefers the 8821. You know, for example, if you just have to get transcripts, somebody comes to you and says, oh, I didn't file last year because I lost my W-2s. I lost all my 1099s. That's pretty common too, right? You have somebody who's lost all of their wage and income statements. That's what they're called, wage and income statements. So you just need to get transcripts so that you can file the tax return. That's 8821 is good for that. You can just use the 8821 to get those wage and income transcripts, or if somebody needs a copy of a prior year return, you can also get a transcript of that prior year return by using the 8821. So the 8821 is just fine for getting documents, and some practitioners will use it exclusively for that. Now, the last tax practitioner, Charles, has an answer very different from any of the others. And he states, I have the client sign both the 8821 and the 2848. And I explain to them why I do this. So presumably, let's say he has a client come into the office, they're sitting in front of him anyway. He decides to, have them sign an engagement letter, takes a deposit, and on that first meeting, he has them sign both the 8821 and the 2848. Okay. Now he says, if you only submit the 8821, the IRS cannot ask you any questions about the client. Well, they can, but they shouldn't, right? And they shouldn't, because the 8821 is for tax information only. It doesn't allow you to do any kind of representation work. It only allows you to obtain information like transcripts. Okay. Now, any discussion about when will the client file their return, how will they pay this, these are discussions I am not ready to have at the onset. And the 8821 says you can't answer these questions. In addition, an 8821 implies no form of fiduciary responsibility. The 2848 should be best withdrawn after an engagement. So there are many tax practitioners who believe this, who believe that once you terminate an engagement with a client, that at that point you should withdraw your power of attorney from the IRS, from the CAF unit. They obtain their CAF listing. They do a Freedom of Information Act request in order to obtain their CAF listing, which is the list of the clients that they are allowed to represent. Okay, that's what your CAF listing is. And they will withdraw. They will formally withdraw from the taxpayers that they've finished representing. Charles does this, as you can see, he states, but Jeff does not. He leaves the 2848 in place. So this is his practice model, Jeff's practice model. He doesn't withdraw, but Charles does. All right, so he says 2848 should best be withdrawn after an engagement. So 8821's up front and 2848's already signed for later when I'm taking on the client and know what I am up against. Okay, so as you can see, these are very different answers. All of these different practitioners have a different way of doing things. You're going to have your own way of doing things when you start doing representation work. And many of you maybe have done a little bit already, either as maybe an employee of a firm or maybe even representing a family member like I did under the rules for limited practice, right? Which we're going to discuss a little bit. But as you can see, there's no like real consensus between tax practitioners on which form is best and when you should use it and when not to and everything else. Everybody has very different opinions on when they're going to use a particular form for a particular thing. But the 2848 is the power of attorney, and that is the only form that will allow you to either advocate for the taxpayer or represent the taxpayer before the IRS. Okay, in order to represent the taxpayer before the IRS, you need a 2848. And generally, to use the 2848, you have to be an enrolled practitioner. All right, generally. There are very limited exceptions to that rule, which we will discuss. But in general, In order to use the 2848 and represent a taxpayer before the IRS or represent a business before the IRS, you have to be an enrolled practitioner, which means you have to be an enrolled agent, a certified public accountant, or an attorney. Okay? Now, the Form 8821 can be used by anyone. All right? It can also be used by things like banks or employers. Very, very common for a bank to request 8821 on behalf of a taxpayer or on behalf of a customer who is applying for something like a mortgage or a business loan. They want to make sure that the taxpayer is not lying about how much money they make. So the bank itself will request IRS transcripts for the prior 3 years. So that's a bank or a lender using the 8821 in order to obtain sensitive taxpayer information from the IRS. So that's a very common use for the 8821 that's not necessarily related to tax practitioners, right? So that would be like a bank or a mortgage lender. Now, the 8821, the official name is a tax information authorization. Many times it's shortened to TIA. It authorizes any individual, corporation, firm, organization, or partnership to inspect or receive confidential information for the type of tax and periods listed. Any third party may be designated to receive taxpayer information. Now, the 8821 is only a disclosure form, so that's all it can be used for. You can't use this form to advocate for the taxpayer in any way. You can only request information using this form, like request transcripts or request prior year wage and income statements, like W-2s from 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that sort of thing. You can use the 8821 for that. But if the taxpayer is already in collections for whatever reason, then the 8821 is basically useless. If they're in collections already, then you need a 2848. You need a power of attorney. The IRS won't talk to you. IRS collections won't talk to you if you only have an 8821. All right? Because 8821 is only to obtain information. It doesn't allow any kind of advocacy. Okay, so you can't advocate for the taxpayer with only an 8821. You need a 2848 or a power of attorney in order to do that, to advocate. Okay? Now, in terms of the information on the forms, it's similar. So a 2848 and a 8821 both require the taxpayer to list the type of tax, the tax form number, and the year or periods that the authorization covers, and the specific tax matters that apply. Any prior tax years may be specified, but only future tax periods ending no later than 3 years after the date of 8821 is received by the IRS are recognized. Basically, what this means is you can go back as far as you want in terms of years, but you can only go forward 3 years. And that's the same on the 2848 as well as the 8821. You can only go 3 years in the future on the form. And you can go back as far as you need to. All right. If I wanted to file a 2848 on behalf of a taxpayer and say, I need information on 1980, it's not going to guarantee the IRS is going to have any information on that year, but I can put that on the form and it'll be accepted. It'll be fine. It'll process. But if I go more than 3 years in advance, then the IRS will reject the form. They'll reject the whole thing. You'll have to get a brand new form and submit it if you do that wrong. All right. It won't be processed. Now, the Form 2848 is the IRS power of attorney. It's not like the 8821, which just allows you to obtain information. The 2848 allows you to obtain information too, right? I could use the 2848 to call up the IRS and say, hey, I need a copy of this taxpayer's transcripts. Right? I can request any kind of information like that with the 2848. But with the 2848, I can also advocate for the taxpayer. All right, so it allows me to do both. Okay, it's power of attorney. Now, the use of the Form 2848 is limited to enrolled practitioners only, except when used under the rules for limited practice. All right, the most common situations where the POA might be used by an unenrolled preparer are family members or full-time bookkeepers representing an employer. Those are the two situations that I've seen where a 2848 is applicable with an unenrolled preparer using that form. And it's perfectly fine for them to do that under the rules for limited practice. And as I've mentioned before, my first rep case, my first IRS rep case, was a case where I represented a family member, a close family member, and I used a Form 2848, and I was not an enrolled agent yet at that time. I was just trying to help him. It was a pro bono case. He could barely speak English, and he had years of unfiled returns. He had an audit that went horribly in the past. He didn't know what he was doing, and I stepped in as a family member to help him. And at that point, I was just a bookkeeper, and I had a few years of tax experience, a couple of college courses, and that was it. All right. So I had to learn like by the seat of my pants. I had to learn on the fly how to do that. But I had limited practice rights because of my relationship to that family member. Okay. So you right now, even if you're not an enrolled practitioner yet, you could fill out a Form 2848 for a close family member and represent that taxpayer before all levels of the IRS by the nature of your relationship to that person. For example, if you had an adult child, like a 22-year-old in college, and they were going to get audited for some reason, even if you're not an enrolled agent, you could fill out a 2848, have your kids sign it, and say, okay, I'm going to represent you, Johnny, because I at least have some experience and you have no idea, right? So you would be able to do that. You could represent a parent, a sibling, a half sibling, a step sibling, and you can also represent, any of your children, whether or not they're minors or adults. That's one of the exceptions to the 2848 being limited to enrolled practitioners. Now, the other example, which I've seen pretty commonly, is full-time bookkeepers representing an employer. And what this means is that full-time employee, usually it's a bookkeeper or a payroll supervisor or something like that, that employee has limited practice rights, but they're allowed to represent their employer before the IRS, advocate for that employer, and also receive kind of like any documents or reports or transcripts that they might need. And like I said, usually it's a payroll issue. You have someone who's like a payroll supervisor. They're not an enrolled agent, but they know payroll backwards and forwards. And they're working for a company, and some issue comes up with the company's payroll and they're receiving IRS letters. So that particular employee can fill out a 2848 as a full-time employee of that employer and then represent that employer before the IRS. And by representing them, what that usually means is they're contacting the IRS to try to figure out what's going on with the payroll issue. All right. So that's also very commonplace. And then in that case, that employee would be able to represent the taxpayer. And by taxpayer, that's the employer. All right. The employer themselves, the business. Okay. All right. Now, if you want to see online examples of these forms filled out, you have to actually look at some of the older IRS publications. For whatever reason, the IRS used to have examples of these forms, the 8821 and the 2848, in IRS publication 947. They stopped doing that. So publication 947 has been updated recently, but there's no examples of the form 8821 or the 2848 in any of the recent versions of this publication. But older versions of the IRS publication 947 are available on the IRS website, just like old versions of IRS tax forms are available, right? So you could search for a Form 1040 from 1955 or 1980 or 1960. You could see all of those old forms on the IRS website. All of those are archived. So it is possible to search for them. And here is a link on the IRS website to an older version of IRS publication 947. So you can see the Form 8821 and 2848 actual IRS examples of these forms filled out. And I'm going to show it to you right now. So here we are on the publication 947. This is the April 2015 version. This publication has been updated numerous times over the years, and it has been updated more recently than this, but this is an older version, and I'm showing it to you because it has an official example of the 2848 filled out. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you, and you can look up these pubs. They're on the IRS website, like I said, and there's a link on your slide. As you can see, it says IRS prior, which means it's the IRS prior year publication. And there's a more recent version of this publication that's available for you to see. But this is a 2848. In the past, the 2848, older versions of the 2848 had a spot to list two spouses. That's not the case anymore. So as of right now, current year, if you want to fill out a 2848 or an 8821 and it's a married couple, you need to have a form for each of those people. They're each individual humans. And I mean, it is possible that you're going to end up representing one and not the other. They could have a falling out, whatever. So each individual human needs their own 2848 or 8821. Now, if you have a taxpayer who owns a business, for example, you have a single shareholder S Corp, or you have a taxpayer, husband and wife, let's say that they own a C Corp, you can't put the business on the same 2848 as the individual. You would need to have two of these then at that point. All right. So if you have a person who owns an S Corp, for example, they have their S Corp, and then they also have their individual returns, right? The S Corporation and the individual human person who's the owner are considered separate, and you would need to have a 2848 for each of them. All right. So this is assuming that it's not just a sole proprietor, right? If it's a sole proprietor, then the Schedule C is part of the Form 1040, right? And that's why down here it says tax form number 940, 720, 1040, because you could potentially have a sole proprietor, right? Obviously, Schedule C taxpayer or Schedule F if it's a farmer who has employees, and you might be contacting the IRS about the income tax on their individual return. But let's say it's a Schedule C taxpayer that has employees and they're filing payroll returns, then you might be contacting the IRS about the 941s, which are, it's payroll tax. Okay. Now, if it's like that and it's a Schedule C, then all of that can go on one form. All right. But if it's a person who, for example, owns an S Corp or a C Corp or a partnership, then those entities need their own 2848. All right. Okay. You can't just put the taxpayers, because the S Corp is its own taxpayer, a C Corp is its own taxpayer, a partnership is a taxpayer. All right, so those entities would need their own power of attorney, their own 2848. Now, the same individual might be signing these forms, right? So if you have Stan Doe, this is the name that the IRS uses in this sample. Stan, if he's the owner of an S Corp, maybe a single shareholder S Corp, then he would be the owner, officer, shareholder, employee, whatever you want to call it, company president. Then he would be signing the 2848 as the basically the company president or the company owner. And then his 2848 for him as an individual would be a separate 2848. But you'd want to do both. Okay, you wouldn't be able to represent the entity unless you had a 2848 for that entity as well. Now, you want to use the most recent version of the Form 2848. I think the easiest way to make sure you have the most recent version is to either go directly to the IRS website and search for a copy of it there. All right. Don't just use Google and take it off some random website, because a lot of those websites like PDF Filler and those PDF websites that just are basically designed to attract people to download and click on ads and stuff like that, many times they will have just an older version of the form and you'll just be wasting time for yourself. Because if you submit an older version of the 2848 and there's a more recent version available, many times the CAF unit will reject your form. So the easiest way is to go directly to the IRS website and search for the 2848 there, or take it off of your most recent version of your software, not a prior year version of your software. If you're using an older version of your software, basically just like file a delinquent return. You know, if you have somebody who has to do all the way back to 2017 or something, they have multiple years of unfiled returns. You want to make sure you're not drawing your 2848 from an older version of your software or from an older year. Okay. And a lot of tax practitioners don't know that. Many times, if you're using an older year software, it's not updated with this type of thing. Those forms are not updated. And you want to use the most recent version of the 2848, which means you either have to go directly to the IRS website or you have to use the version of the form that's in your most recent software, your professional tax software that you're using to file tax returns in the current tax year. Okay, that's what I mean. But I'm going to use this as an example because this is basically an official IRS example of how to fill out the 2848, and it shows you the information that you need to put in here. All right, so you need to put in the taxpayer's name and address, the name that they use on their tax return, or for example, if the person has changed their name because of a marriage or something like that, then you would use their current name, whatever it is, legally, their legal current name, whatever is on file with the Social Security Administration. That's what you want to use. Okay. Taxpayer identification number here would be their social security number, if they have a social security number, an ITIN, if they have an ITIN, or if it's an entity like Corporation ABC Inc., then you would use the EIN. All right. Daytime phone number, the IRS always wants you to put in the taxpayer's phone number. In here, I usually leave it blank, or I will use my phone number. All right, because I don't want the taxpayer contacted directly by the IRS. I want the IRS to contact me if they're going to contact anybody. Now, the line here that says plan number, that has to do with retirement plans that have a filing requirement. We're talking about the form 5500, and most of the time you're not going to be using this line, you personally, as a tax practitioner, unless you specialize in retirement plans, which is rare. All right, but that's what that means, plan number. Name and address for the representative is where you would list your name and address as the representative. You do not list the name of your business. So if your name is Jim Smith, but the name of your business is Smith's Spectacular Tax Services, that's fine. You can name your business anything you want, but you don't want to put your business name here. Because if you're representing either a individual, or for example, if you're representing a corporation or a partnership before the IRS, you are representing them as a human. You, as the human, are representing either an entity or another taxpayer, another human. All right. You can't list the name of your business here. So you press a check mark here if you want to be sent copies of notices and communications. I always check this by default because I want to receive copies of any letters that the IRS might send to the taxpayer. All right. Now the CAF number is where you would put your CAF number. Many of you might not have a CAF number yet. If you don't have a CAF number yet, what you type into this line is you type the word none, N-O-N-E, none. And then a CAF number will be issued to you. And this is regardless of whether you file a 2848 or an 8821. You put the word none where it says CAF number, and the IRS will issue you a CAF number. They send it to you in the form of a letter. When you receive that letter, you want to keep it. You want to hold on to it because that is the CAF number that you're going to use for the rest of your career. All right. You usually will only be issued one CAF number. Now, I've done webinars before where I've mentioned that it is possible for tax practitioners to have more than one CAF number. It is. Most of the time when that happens, it's when a tax practitioner is working for a firm, for example, I'm working for a CPA firm and I'm an enrolled practitioner and they have clients where I'm listed on the 2848 as a second representative. I worked for a CPA firm where this was the case. I was listed as the second representative because if the managing partner wasn't there at the office or they were on vacation or whatever, then I would be able to take IRS calls or I would be able to call the IRS on behalf of that client. I only have one CAF number. I want you to understand that. Me personally, I only have one CAF number. I've had one CAF number my entire career. All right? Let's just get that out there. But there are some practitioners where you might be working for a firm, right? You're an employee of that firm and you have a CAF number, right? But you don't want your firm to know that you have maybe a side gig and you want to keep all of that private. In that case, you can request another CAF number and then use that CAF number for your private clients. And then the copies of notices and communications that relate to your firm, you use the firm CAF number. And the copies of notices and communications that relate to your own private client base, you know, the one that you have privately, your own clients, maybe through your home office or something like that, then you would use a different CAF number for those. All right, so I have never personally done this, but I do know tax practitioners that have done this. They'll have two CAF numbers, one that they use with their employer, right? If they're working for a CPA firm or a lawyer's office or something like that. And then the other CAF number they use with their private clients for their little side gig or their home-based business or whatever. All right, you can do that. It's perfectly fine. I've never done that personally, but I do know of tax practitioners who have done that. Now, one more thing with regards to multiple CAFs. If you have multiple CAF numbers, once you become an enrolled agent, every time you renew your EA license, enrolled agents have to renew every 3 years. All right, license renewal is every 3 years. Every time you renew your license, you're required to list all of your CAF numbers, which is why you don't want to have like 10 CAF numbers floating around. All right. I've only had one. I know tax practitioners who maybe have two, and when you do receive your CAF number letter, you save it, you know, scan it, put it on your hard drive because that's the CAF that you're going to use forever. All right. Okay. And you can receive a CAF number before you become an enrolled agent. I received a CAF number years before I was an enrolled agent. When I did my first rep case, when I was representing my family member, like I said, I filled out the 2848. I put none here because I didn't have a CAF number. And the IRS issued me a CAF number to represent that client, who, like I said, was a close family member of mine. Now the PTIN goes here. So everybody's got to have a PTIN if you do tax returns for compensation. So the PTIN goes there. All right. And PTIN applies to you as an individual, right? A PTIN is just like a social security number, but instead of identifying you as a taxpayer, the PTIN identifies you as a paid preparer in the paid preparer section of the tax return. All right. So you're going to have to put a PTIN in there. Now, after you enter in the PTIN, which you should have as a tax professional, you want to put in your telephone number here and your fax number here. And you need a fax machine, all right? You need to have a fax machine or an e-fax or an internet fax or whatever you want to call it, electronic fax. I actually have both because my time is really valuable and sometimes the e-faxes delay. They won't fax immediately. And if I'm calling PPS, Practitioner Priority Service, the IRS, about a particular taxpayer's case, I don't want to be waiting 10 minutes for a fax to go through. So I have an old-fashioned fax machine that's hooked up to a landline because it's immediate. And like I said, 10 minutes of my time is really valuable, especially if I've already been waiting on hold with the Practitioner Priority Service for, you know, half an hour or whatever. So you want to put your fax number here. All right, whether you have a digital fax or a landline or whatever you use. And then if you do have a new address, telephone number, or fax number, checking these boxes will update it with the CAF, presumably. Sometimes it will actually take a few times for this to update. And just realize that if you do check this box here to update for your address, your telephone number, your fax number, the only place that that will update it is with the CAF unit. It won't update your EA license. It won't update your PTIN account. It won't update your EFIN. It doesn't update anywhere else. There is nothing like that with the IRS. Every single address change is considered separate. So if you do check here, if you have a new address, the only place that it will update your address is with the CAF unit. All right. And also, I have mentioned this before, if the taxpayer has a new address, filing a 2848 with the taxpayer's new address also does not update the taxpayer's official address of record. In order to update the taxpayer's official address of record with the IRS, you have to file a tax return, which means an actual tax return. If it's an individual, that means a Form 1040 or a Form 1040X. An extension is not a tax return and it will not update the taxpayer's address. The only other way to update the taxpayer's address is to file a formal change of address form with the IRS. All right, so just realize that filing the 2848, you put the taxpayer's name and address there, but if it's changed since their last tax return, filing this will not update their records with the IRS. It won't update the taxpayer's records. Most of the time when you have an individual taxpayer, what you're going to put here is income tax. And then you put Form 1040 right there. That's the form number. If it was a Schedule C taxpayer, you wouldn't put Schedule C in here because the Schedule C is part of the Form 1040. The Schedule C is just another schedule with the Form 1040. But for example, if it's a Schedule C taxpayer that has employees and you want to contact the IRS about payroll, then you would need to put the payroll tax forms here. Put payroll tax here and then the Form 941 or 944, right? You'd put the payroll tax returns that would apply. Just realize one other thing. If the taxpayer has a shared responsibility payment from a prior year, from when the shared responsibility payment was still in effect, related to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, that's considered a separate tax. So you would have to list that separately here. If the taxpayer had a shared responsibility payment and you wanted to talk to the IRS about it, to ask a question or ask how much it was, or if the taxpayer owed it or whatever. Now, you have to put the years or periods applicable, which means any tax year that you want to talk to the IRS about, you have to list here. Usually when I do it, I just list, for example, the year 2000, and then I put a dash, and then I put this year, 2021 or 2022, right? You can go up to 3 years in the future. Okay, that's the maximum, but you can go back as far as you want on this form. That doesn't mean that the IRS is going to have that information, right? Because the IRS does purge old records. But if they do have that information and you have the year listed on here, they'll talk to you about it. All right. If the year is not listed here, then they won't talk to you about it. They can't. But you cannot put all years. You're not allowed to do that. You can't put all years. You have to list specific years. So you can write, through, or put a dash, or you can list all the years individually like they have here, but you got to put a year. You can't just put all years or any years or anything else like that. If you put all years or any years, the CAF unit will reject your form and send it back. Additional acts authorized. I never fill this out. You can actually technically sign a taxpayer's return as an enrolled practitioner under very narrow circumstances, certain circumstances. And we talk about that in the webinars for part 3. But I never check any of these other boxes here. Now, the place where the taxpayer has to sign is here. That's their signature, all right? They would print their name below here. Usually this is typed out automatically by your software if you use software. And then they would write the date here. The taxpayer would write the date. The title you would list here, for example, if it was a corporation, and the 2848 was for a corporation, but the person who's signing it is like the company president. You would put that here. You would also put title here if it was a situation where it was like a guardian, signing for someone who is disabled or in a coma or something like that, or for example, a parent signing for a minor child, then you would put that here as well, like parent for minor child. Okay? Okay. And then you, as an enrolled agent, once you become an enrolled agent, what you would put down here, your designation would be C as an enrolled agent. And once you get your EA license number, the license number will go here. All right, that'll be on your treasury card, your EA license number. If you were, for example, just representing a family member or an employer, for example, under the rules for limited practice, then you would just put NA or not applicable here. All right. For example, if you were a parent representing an adult child, but you weren't an enrolled agent or any kind of enrolled practitioner yet, then you would just put not applicable and you would put F for family member here. If, for example, it was a situation where you were representing a family member, you put your signature here, and then you want to make sure that the date here matches the date on the taxpayer's signature. All right, that's just a pro tip from me to you. I've had the form rejected before when the dates didn't match. So I just strongly recommend that these dates match. All right, your signature date should match the taxpayer's signature date. All right, so that's the 2848 example. Now, the publication 947, this older version, does not include a copy of the form 8821 filled out. If you go back even further to the 2009 version of the publication 947, there is a version of the 8821 filled out in this publication. I don't know why the IRS stopped including examples of this form filled out. I feel like it would help, especially newer tax practitioners, know how to do this. But this form has changed a lot since then. So this is a very old version of the form, and it looks a lot different now than it did in 2008. So I'm just showing this to you so you can see that, yes, the IRS used to include copies of this filled out so people could see what it looked like when it was completed. But the newer versions of the 947 don't include these forms. And the 8821 has changed a lot since then. So I'm going to fill one out for you and show you how to do it just online. So let me show you how that's done. Okay, so I have my sample form here, which I've pretty much filled out. The taxpayer's name and address goes here. All right, John Smith, 123 Main Street. This is all fake, but you would put the taxpayer's name and address here. The taxpayer's identification number would go here. Now, if it's an entity, what you put here is the EIN, the employer identification number. That's what you would put here, and then the entity's name and address. For daytime telephone number, if I'm going to put a telephone number here, it's always going to be mine. I don't put the taxpayer's telephone number here because if the IRS is going to be contacting anybody about what's on this form, I want them to contact me, not the taxpayer. Okay, so I put my telephone number here. You can also leave it blank. If you leave this part blank, the form won't be rejected. Okay, plan number, you would never put anything here unless it was a retirement plan. All right, a retirement plan would put a number here, and I've only seen them in CPE courses, that sort of thing. But the plan number, you would never use that unless it was actually a retirement plan that had a filing requirement. Now, your name and address would go here as the practitioner. So you would put your name here and then your business address. If you have, for example, another tax practitioner in your office and they want to be listed as a designee as well, or for example, if you have an employee and you want them to be able to make calls as well to the IRS, then you can list them here. Remember, this is just a tax information authorization form, so anyone can use this form. You do not have to be an enrolled practitioner in order to use the 8821. So basically anybody could be listed here as long as the taxpayer signs the form and agrees to it. Okay, so doesn't have to be an enrolled practitioner, but once again, this form doesn't allow you to advocate. So you can only request taxpayer information like transcripts or that sort of thing with this form. If you have a CAF number, you list it here. You would put the word none, like I said, if it was the first time you're filing the form and you wish to have a CAF number issued. Your PTIN goes here if you have a PTIN. All right, you should have a PTIN already. If you don't have a PTIN yet, like you've just kind of started in this business and or you're going to school and you don't have a PTIN yet, then you should obtain one as soon as possible if you don't have one yet. All right. Now, the telephone number that you want to list here is yours, and the fax number that you want to list here also is yours. All right, not the taxpayers. Okay, now tax information, there's a new checkbox here. This is relatively new. This has also been added to the Form 2848 as well. This is a situation where you would check this box if you were using an intermediate service provider in order to obtain the taxpayers' records or their transcripts or anything like that. An intermediate service provider is software that's used by tax professionals to obtain transcripts basically in bulk from the IRS. It makes things a lot easier than logging in and using the IRS e-services. That software costs money. Some of it's pretty pricey. The most popular ones that I know of are the Tax Help software and Pitbull software. I don't use an intermediate service provider software. I don't do enough rep work in order to justify the cost. If I need to get IRS transcripts for a client, I just log into my e-services account and get them that way. Okay? I'll do a separate video on that so you can see how I do it. But some tax practitioners or some tax offices do so much rep work that they use an intermediate service provider. It's a type of software that allows them to download dozens or maybe even hundreds of transcripts and IRS notices at a time for a large client bases. If you are planning to use a software like that, like Tax Help software or Canopy, I think is another one, or Pitbull, in order to obtain IRS transcripts, then you have to check this box. They're just basically like a middleman between IRS e-services and you, but apparently the IRS decided that this was something that the taxpayer had to agree to if you're going to use an intermediate service provider. All right. If you're just obtaining transcripts by contacting the IRS directly or by using IRS e-services directly, you don't need to check this box. Okay. Now, the type of tax information, if you're just trying to obtain information about an individual taxpayer's account, what you would put here is just income tax. Okay. So for example, let's say you were calling to find out, oh, how many unfiled years does this taxpayer have? Can you tell me? Then that's what you would put here, income tax. And then you would put Form 1040 if it was an individual taxpayer. And of course, if, for example, if it was a Schedule C taxpayer or a Schedule F taxpayer, they owned a business and then they had employees, then if you wanted to ask about the payroll tax, that's a separate tax form. So you would want to put 941 or 941, 940, or 944, whatever applied to that particular employer. All right. So we're talking about a situation where you might have, a Schedule C business or a Schedule F business. So there's more going on in the mix than just income tax. It might be payroll tax as well. All right. Okay. See, it's listed here as one of the taxes. I'm touching the screen like you can see what I'm doing. I have to remember that you can't see my finger. All right. But this is what I'm pointing at is the type of tax information. 99% of what you're going to be calling the IRS about, if you're going to be using this form, is one of these on this list. It would be unusual for you to be contacting the IRS about anything outside of this, but it can happen. There are other types of tax information out there. This is not a comprehensive list, but 99% of what you're going to be calling on is on this list. And to be honest, most of the time when you're contacting the IRS using an 8821, it's just going to be income tax, individual income tax for humans. All right. Of course, like I said, this form can be used on behalf of something like a C corporation or an S corporation if you need to obtain transcripts or whatever. But most of the time when you're going to be using this form, it's just going to be an individual taxpayer, a human being, and you're contacting the IRS about income tax. Okay, so let's say I'm contacting the IRS about income tax for, what was the guy's name? I don't remember. John Smith, my imaginary guy. So I'm contacting the IRS about his income tax problem. And let's say he's a delinquent filer and I need to get information on prior year returns. He doesn't know how many years he has unfiled. And obviously, I don't know either unless I call the IRS and ask about it. So let's say I want to be careful or cautious, and I'm going to put 2000 to 2022 because I can go a couple of years in advance, up to 3. So 2000 to 2022, or you can write like this, 2000 through 2022, and that will cover all of the years in between. Okay. Now, for specific tax matters, usually I put not applicable. And the reason why is because in the form instructions for this form, if you put non-applicable, not applicable in the specific tax matters, then generally that will allow you to ask any kind of general question that you might have about the taxpayer's account. And I'll show you what it says in the form instructions for this area so you can kind of understand what I mean. So here I am in the form instructions for the 8821, which is the tax information authorization form. And you can see where it says tax information, columns A through C. You enter the type of tax information, the tax form number, the years or periods, and the specific matter. So for example, you may list income 1040 for calendar year 2018, right? So you have to specify the years, as I've mentioned. Excise 720, for example, if it's an excise tax return. And as I said, the IRS right here says don't use a general reference such as all years, all periods, or all taxes. Any tax information authorization with a general reference will be returned. They basically won't process it. Okay. Now, you can list future tax years or periods, as I said. However, the IRS will not record on the CAF system future tax years or periods listed that exceed 3 years from December 31st of the year that the IRS receives the tax information authorization. So you can go up to 3 years in advance, but not beyond that. Now, as you can see right here in the instructions, it says enter not applicable in column D if you are not limiting your designee's authority to inspect and or receive all confidential tax information as described in columns A, B, and C. Okay, so you would put not applicable here if you basically wanted to give yourself access to all of the taxpayers' information related to the Form 1040, their income tax, for the particular years that you have listed. All right, so if you put this here, basically you can call the IRS and ask about any kind of transcript information or whether or not they filed a return in that particular year or whatever. You can't advocate for the taxpayer with this form, but you can request information about any of the years that are listed. All right. Now, this is retention or revocation of prior tax information authorizations. This is only if you want the IRS, for whatever reason, to retain any prior 8821s that were already in effect. Because generally, when you file a brand new 8821 or a 2848, those are considered separate forms, by the way. So an 8821 won't revoke a 2848 and vice versa. But if you file an 8821 for a client, let's say this year, and then next year you file an updated one, with more years or more forms on it or whatever, then the old one will automatically be revoked. And the new one is the one that will remain in force with the CAF unit. You can retain a prior tax information authorization if you check this box and you attach a copy of the prior tax information authorization that you want to retain. I've never done this. Usually when I file a brand new 8821 or a brand new 2848, it's because I've updated the form and I want information about newer years or more additional years or whatever. So I don't ever do this. But you could potentially, I guess, retain a prior authorization in the CAF unit as well as include a new one. but I don't know why you would ever want to do that, but you can. Now, this is where you would have the taxpayer sign. If signed by a corporate officer, partner, guardian, partnership representative, or designated individual, executor, receiver, administrator, trustee, or individual other than the taxpayer, I certify I have the legal authority to execute this form with respect to the tax matters and tax periods shown on line 3 above. So this is a jurat. A jurat is something that you sign under penalty of perjury. And this is similar to the jurat on the 2848, which is a power of attorney. Now, 9 times out of 10, the person that's going to be signing this down here is just going to be the taxpayer themselves, right? So we have our taxpayer's name is John Smith. I'm using the pencil tool to write my little fake signature. Okay, John Smith. John Smythe. I put an put an E at the end of that. You get what I mean. And then you put in the date here, right? You put in the date. That's a 7. It's not a very good 7. Let's put like one of those little lines right there. Okay, I can't do it. It's a 7. I know it doesn't look very much like a 7, but you get me. So for the print name, you would print his name here. So where it says print name, you would just type the taxpayer's name there. The taxpayer signing for themselves, I just put self right there. Okay. But sometimes there'll be a situation where a parent is signing for a child, for example, a minor that has investments, and now you have to pull their transcripts because the minor is getting a demand for a return. I've done that more than once because the minor, who's like maybe 8 or 10, now has to file a tax return because they were gifted in investments by their grandparents or whatever. And you have to obtain the transcripts, but the 8-year-old isn't going to sign this. The child would be listed as the taxpayer at the top in the first box, but then the parent is the one who's actually signing this form and giving the authorization. And then you would put as title, you would put parent for minor child. Okay? And for example, if you were requesting transcripts for an S Corp, then you would put the title, either CEO or company president, company officer, whatever. All right, depending on the situation. 9 times out of 10, it's just going to be an individual taxpayer you're using this for, and they're going to be signing their own name down here, and you're just going to put self. All right, but there's a lot of other types of scenarios out there that can happen, obviously. And the title you would use if it wasn't the taxpayer actually signing for themselves and they were signing on behalf of an entity or a partnership, or for example, for a minor child. Okay? All right. And that's this form. And then you would fax it to the IRS, or you can also use the new upload portal. And I'm going to show how to use that in a separate video, as well as e-services. That's going to be separate. Now here, back to our slides, here are some links at the very end where you can view the older versions of IRS Publication 947 that have examples of the 2848 filled out. This also is IRS guidance on POAs for trusts and retirement plans. And this is an actual IRS document that shows some rare examples on what an 8821 or a 2848 looks like when it's filled out for a trust or a retirement plan. And then there's also an SBA example. This is the Small Business Administration, if you're not familiar with the SBA, and that shows you a more current version of the 8821. These are all government websites. All right, they're all legitimate government websites, so you can use all of these as kind of guidance if you have any questions about it. The questions on how to fill out these forms that you can't answer by reading the instructions themselves. All right. Okay, that's the end for this one, and check back soon for more bonus videos.